Hi, I'm Scott Richmond, CEO of Bookstr. Welcome to Bookstr Business. We have Brian Portnoy, author of The Geometry of Wealth, here with us. Happy to be here, right?
I'm happy to be here.
So tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Absolutely. So The Geometry of Wealth tries to answer the question for individuals and for families, am I going to be okay? I've been in the investment world for a long time. Most people find money to be intimidating, investments to be complex and intimidating, and we get really involved in the weeds. We dive way down the rabbit hole too quickly without stepping back and saying, well, what am I really trying to solve for here? I wanted to write a book that focused on this notion of being wealthy, being able to really underwrite a meaningful life as opposed to being rich. And the Geometry of Wealth is the product or the project that kind of came out of that big picture thinking.
Nice. And so your background is varied, right? You were an educator, then you were in finance, then you went back into kind of education again.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I always like to describe my my career as nonlinear. I guess the thread throughout it all is that I've always been kind of curious, and I've always had a passion for learning and for teaching. So I did have an academic career. I did a doctorate at the University of Chicago, and then I became very interested in the markets and investing, and I was in a variety of investment research roles for about 15 years or so, and along the way I got the writing bug. Professionally, I wanted to figure out some stuff that was swimming around in my head, and personally I was just getting older, and my wife and I have 3 kids and began to just think big picture about what I was doing with my life and thinking about my kids' path forward. And so I wrote a book a few years ago called The Investor's Paradox, which is about investment decision making per se. And this book is actually a prequel for Star Wars fans like myself. I like prequels. This book is a prequel that, as I've mentioned, steps back and asks some bigger picture questions. So it's been an interesting journey because I haven't felt like I needed to stick with one defined career where other people say, okay, this is the way you need to be. I've kind of tried to write my own story.
And so with you writing the prequel,
Yeah.
Is that kind of like your life journey was like kind of the same way where you were first like in the technical weeds of it and then looking more at the big picture?
Right. I mean, I'm still in the investment world. I'm the head of education for a big investment platform. And so I work with financial advisors and clients all over the country to help make better decisions about money, including specific investment decisions. So I'm still in that world. And what became clear to me over the last couple years in particular is that the conversation about money is really hard, whether it be between a financial advisor and a client, between husband and wife, between partners, between parents and children, any dynamic there. Money is never a comfortable conversation. It's very stressful. It's very overwhelming. And so I wanted to put my 2 cents in to really help structure a better conversation about money.
Right. And it looks like in the book, you're really talking about fulfillment and the whole path towards fulfillment and kind of how wealth fits into that.
Yes. I make a big distinction between being wealthy and being rich. So when we think about money and investments, having more money, making great investments, beating the market, lots of different ways to come at that, that seems to capture the imagination. That's sort of the American money culture in particular. And what I see both professionally and personally is that quest to be rich, that quest to have more money and the things that money buys, doesn't really produce a great level of happiness. It might give you a little bit of excitement in the here and now, but it quickly fades. There's a concept in psychology known as hedonic adaptation, which is a mouthful, but it basically says we quickly become accustomed to everything in life, both good and bad. So the day-to-day of our happiness really is not impacted by how much money we make for the most part. That said, there's this other concept of being wealthy, which is the ability to underwrite a meaningful life, what I call funded contentment. And there we can think more deeply about those occasions where we asked ourselves, okay, am I living a good life? Am I really doing what I want to do? Am I finding contentment and a deeper form of happiness? And in that case, money, if spent wisely, can actually contribute to that deeper sense of contentment.
And so for their contentment, is there kind of a, how would you say, like some people their contentment is at 75,000, some people their contentment's at 1 million. Like to fund that contentment.
Right.
How do you contextualize that? Or like I know even for myself, like I don't necessarily know how to invest or
Right.
or how to raise money or what to do.
Right.
So that's what like you're trying to explain to people
Right.
kind of how to approach that, right?
Right. That's a big part of it. I mean, a lot of numbers get thrown around, so there's a lot of academic studies that would suggest that an income of or a family household income of $75,000 per year is the threshold, and beyond that, more money doesn't lead to more happiness on a day-to-day basis. That number is quite fluid and subjective. It depends on your personal circumstances, whether you have children or not, what part of the country you live in. I mean, living in New York City versus living in a rural area, you're going to have a very different cost of living. I think the general thrust of what sociologists and economists and psychologists have come up with is that if you can make ends meet in a sort of a basic income kind of way, then making more and more does not produce a deeper level of day-to-day happiness.
So people in a mansion, beautiful pool, all that, they're not necessarily happier than someone who just has
No. I mean, you can be very rich and miserable, and you could just be making ends meet and be quite fulfilled. It's really a matter of defining your purpose and then figuring out how you want to put a financial plan in place to underwrite that purpose. You can do that at a very low income level. You just have to be thoughtful about it, and that's part of what the book's all about, which is that journey toward wealth, setting or being clear about what your purpose is, which changes over time, but I provide some framework as to what are those deep sources of contentment. And once you have a sense of what really motivates you, then you can set priorities, and once you have your broad priorities in place, then you can get into the weeds and the details. Most people start in the weeds and the details, but they never step back.
Great. And then, so it's called Geometry of Wealth. And you have this circle and this, actually, I could see it on the screen already, the circle and the triangle and the square. So can you explain a little bit about what those are, why you use those?
Yeah. I think it's really important to try to communicate with people in the way that they are versus the way that you want them to be. I think too much of finance in particular is technical, it's wonky, it's hard to understand, it's very intimidating. The brain processes pictures many times faster than it does words. So in my role, my day job at Virtus Investment Partners, I do a lot of presentations, and I try to use pictures and cartoons. I try not to make bullet point lists. PowerPoint can just be a death trap in terms of clear communication. So I take data visualization seriously, and I wanted to come up with a simple graphic concept that captures this journey to wealth. And so the shapes really popped into my head one day. The circle represents how we set our purpose, or how we define our purpose. And it's a circle because we're never done doing that. There's the line that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Old Mike Tyson line. The protagonist of the book is the adaptive self, this notion that we're evolving and you can't predict what's going to happen, and good things happen, but bad things happen. So the circle kind of represents that path in life where you are defining and then redefining your purpose. The triangle represents setting priorities, 3 priorities, which I call protect, match, and reach, which is just sort of simple codes for think about risk before you think about return. Most people in the market and with investments, they want to beat the market, they want to make more. The most successful investors in the world think about risk management first. They think about the fact that mistakes are inevitable, and so how do you recover from those mistakes? So instead of being more right, you want to be less wrong. The second priority is what I call match, which is really, in the wonky term, thinking about your balance sheet, what you own versus what you owe. Having your assets and liabilities in some sort of balance, because when they're not in balance, it's very hard to have a stable financial life. And then the third priority I call reach, which is that sense of aspiration. You do want to climb for more, not necessarily more money or more toys, but more connection, more skills in your professional life, more autonomy to do the things that you want to do. Once you've thought about risk management and you have sort of a match on your personal or family balance sheet, you're then in a great position to reach for more. I'll just quickly say that the square is 4 decisions that we make about investing. There's technical terminology, like I said, that can be very overwhelming. And so if you're picking an investment in your 401k plan or just in a discretionary account, you can see that there's a certain return percentage, and the investment can be volatile. It moves up and down. It's also correlated to other things in your portfolio, and it's also liquid or illiquid. Sometimes it's easy to buy and sell things, and other times not. The problem is that's really complicated, really confusing. I came up with sort of a different way to come at it, which is to think about, well, what's the potential growth profile? What's the emotional pain of enjoying that growth profile over time? Because there's no smooth line toward growing wealth. It's pretty jumpy. Fit, so as you think about creating investments that are going to fit into your priorities and purpose, how does that next thing that you add to the portfolio fit with the other elements that you've already put together? And then finally, liquidity, I call the ability to change your mind, okay, flexibility, and that's really important.
So with the risk part,
Yeah.
that really got me thinking,
Yeah.
because I felt like the pain part of your square and the
Yeah.
risk part of your triangle kind of,
Yeah,
they're related.
very much so.
And so I was thinking to myself, because part of what your book is about is fulfillment as well, because to find your fulfillment is pretty risky too.
Yes.
And so I just wanted to know how you look at, because to me, you don't necessarily want to, what's the word for it? The risk management part
Yep.
of life
Yep.
is different than risk management part of your money, right?
Yes and no. I mean, I think it's all of a kind. I talk about this concept of money life in the book. And so, again, we often, because it seems like the right thing to do, kind of revert to this narrow notion of investing. We have to invest right. I think of our money life in much broader terms, in terms of earning, saving, spending, as well as investing. And I think when I talk about risk management, about being less wrong, it's with regard to your money life. Where do you want to live? What's the cost of living? What kind of family do you want to have? What career choices are you making? We're taking risks with our human capital and our intellectual capital and our social capital and our financial capital all the time. It's amazing how just a little bit of thought can go a very long way. And I'll just add, you raised an important point. We think about maximizing gains. We think about making more. I think folks should try to think a little bit about minimizing regret. Minimizing regret is a really powerful emotional frame, and much of money life is actually about minimizing regret more than it is maximizing profits.
Because it kind of stops them in the future, right?
Right.
Once you've regretted something, because it really is like what I see in the investment world is that's why they always go with the winners or people who've already won already.
Right, and so you have people chasing performance, and it just doesn't, you see what's winning and you go after it, but it's really about regret, and just not about your investments per se, but many of your life decisions. You talk to older people who are reflecting upon the life that they've lived, and you'll usually hear stories about things that they regretted doing or not doing. Trying to give a little thought into what those are going to be can have kind of lifelong positive consequences.
Awesome. So we'll take questions from the audience. You could put them in the comments, and I have them being sent to me to my phone here. So I'm going to start with those. So I'll start from the top here. So Jess asks, your book seeks to answer whether or not people can balance pushing for more and being content with what you have. Without spoiling too much of the book, can you tell us a little bit more about your findings?
Well, that's a really important topic. I tackle that at the very end, and there's no great secret or reveal. I basically say that we have this twin impulse. It's wired into who we are, into our brains, and into our systems. We want to push for more, and I don't just mean on the money part, but we're aspirational. We want better relationships. We want more control over our lives. We want to be better at our jobs to really find that passion at work. We want more of those things. So we have that growth instinct, and that's healthy. That's aspirational. That's how we progress not only as people, but as a species. So that's good. On the other hand, there's great psychic value to cherishing enough. That moment of stillness, that moment of appreciating what you have and being in the moment, which is harder and harder given the noise that dominates our world because of technology and so forth.
Right.
I don't think they're compatible. And what I suggest in the book is that there's two steps. One is just recognizing that those two are out there, and you can't have both more and enough simultaneously. But I think each of us in our own way, as we think about that rhythm, that balance can try to find a rhythm between the two.
Right.
It's not a solvable problem, but it's a problem that we can minimize its consequences.
And you were talking about that with happiness too, right? There's like the really short-term kind of glee happiness.
Yes.
Versus having the long-term.
Yeah, I called it experienced happiness versus reflective happiness. Experienced happiness is sort of 99% of our day-to-day. We're in the world, we're doing whatever we're doing, and it's your mood, it's your affect. Much of it is driven by brain impulses that you're not conscious of. It's so-called System 1 thinking, according to neuroscientists. But then you have this reflective happiness, which is the walk in the woods, the conversation with your partner. Hey, is my life going where I think it wants to go? That's a difficult conversation or thought process. It's purpose-oriented. It's physically exhausting in terms of glucose in the brain and really devoting a deliberate thought to that. So it's not something we do every moment of every day. In fact, it's not something we do every day and every week. Those twin pillars of happiness, reflective and experienced happiness, are quite different experiences in our lives.
Cool. Let's take the next question. Sarah asks, do you have a favorite piece you've written for Forbes?
I think I do. I wrote a column or a blog for them a couple years ago called Diversification Means Always Having to Say You're Sorry. One thing, so I spent a lot of time reading and writing and speaking about behavioral finance, which is a fancy term for investor psychology or the psychology of making investment decisions. You'll hear lots of tried and true advice in the world. You know, you want to have a diversified portfolio, you want to buy low and sell high, you want to do all these things. And what I write about frequently is the fact that our brain is actually wired to do the opposite of all the common sense advice we get. So I wrote a piece a couple years ago about diversification. It sounds great. You spread your bets. No one knows where the market's going to go next week, let alone next year. So you own stocks and bonds, U.S. and international, big cap and small cap, all this wonky stuff. The challenge is not with the mathematics of diversification. That makes all the sense in the world. The problem is with the psychology of diversification. We have something in our brains called loss aversion. It's the idea that losses are more painful than gains are pleasurable. Psychologists set a ratio at about 2 to 1. So a $100 loss feels twice as bad as a $100 gain feels good. The real sort of devil's dictionary definition of diversification is that there will always be something in your portfolio that's not working, something that's lagging. And so we own a diversified portfolio. People on TV, the textbooks, our financial advisor, our friends, they say, oh, you have to be diversified. We haven't really, as an investment culture, taken into account the idea that when you own a diversified portfolio, it means that you're always owning losers, and you're often going to be miserable about exactly what you should be doing. So that's why I say diversification means always having to say you're sorry.
Right, and it sounds like life, right? There's always something.
There's always something, yeah.
There's always something.
Yep,
So
yep.
investments are the same thing.
Yep.
And which kind of brings me to a question. What if you just are clueless about investment? So I've read your book, I'm a novice, and so who do I find to help me with this? Is it a financial advisor? What if I can't afford a financial advisor? Like, how does someone get started?
Yeah, it's a really important question. First thing I do, and it's a big theme of this book, which is that put investing in its context. So if you really haven't thought about your purpose, if you haven't sort of mapped out your broad priorities, the investments you make may or may not map up with what you're really trying to accomplish in life. If you get lucky, they will, and but there's a good chance that they won't. So step one is to think about purpose, think about priorities. And within that context, there are wonderful information resources out there and technology on top of all of the writing that's available through books and through Twitter, where there's tons of great advice, and I participate really actively in Twitter. There's a community called FinTwit, Financial Twitter, and I learn something new every day from the people in that world writing interesting blogs. We also have technology through robo-advisors, sort of more of a technology-forward solution to building portfolios, and that's sort of one of the big hot trends. So especially if you're just getting started, the key is to try to save a little bit, even if it's $5 or $10 or $25 or $100. You just sort of chip away. When you look at the math of compounding, it's really remarkable how that adds up over the years, but you have to have that long-term framework. So the technology solutions, such as the various robo-advisor platforms, those very well can be sort of a solution, especially in the case where you're starting with no or relatively little money. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right. So Gemma asks, is there anyone in the public eye who you think does a remarkably good job of handling their finances, who others can look up to?
It's handling their finances. It's such a personal question. It's really hard to say. Here's a general problem with our money culture. It's easier to see assets than liabilities. Okay, so you can see someone eating at a nice restaurant and spending money on the bill, or driving a nice car, or going on a nice vacation. You really don't know what their credit card statement says. You really don't know if they're in debt. It's hard. So in terms of people that are in good shape, it's one thing to name good investors. It's another thing to say, well, this person has a great balance sheet. I simply don't know. The only balance sheet in the world that I know is mine, and I hope it's okay. But there are a variety of bloggers and other pieces of advice that you can follow that give you pretty, I think, savvy but easy to implement advice out there to achieve that sort of balance in your financial life.
Great. Kendra asks, what's next for you? Will you write more books? Of course, our people want to hear about that.
Yeah, I love writing. I mean, it's really a passion for me. I mean, I've always been a passionate student. I've always enjoyed writing, going back to when I was a kid, maybe more passionate reader than writer, but I see those as two sides of the same coin. Some of my most productive writing time is when I'm reading, because that's when I'm generating ideas, and then the writing will come in pretty intense bursts after I've read books and articles on a topic that I'm really curious about. So in a deeper sense, I'll always be writing. It's just really, it's who I am. It's part of my identity. There will probably be another book. I mean, after I wrote the first book, The Investor's Paradox, people said, "Oh, are you going to write a next one?" I'm like, I don't know, maybe. And then the light bulb went on a couple years after I published that. I'm like, okay, I think I know. I haven't had that light bulb moment, but I'm really passionate about engaging with books and other people. And we live in such a content and idea-rich society, digital society, that I kind of can't wait for that light bulb to go on one of these weeks or months or years. And when I do, I'll dive in.
So what was your writing routine when you were writing this book?
It was pretty rigorous in the sense that I've got 3 kids and a wife and a day job and other hobbies. So I had to carve out the time. It requires a great deal of discipline. And honestly, the agreement I made with my wife for both book 1 and book 2 was that I should either be doing my writing or be present with the family / doing my job. So in both cases, in really the 6 to 9 months leading up to the final due date, when the editor or the publisher says, you can't change anything more, because I'm always wanting to tweak things, I would always carve out one of the days, one of the weekend days. So I would choose Saturday or Sunday, and I would really sort of go for it for 10, 12 hours, as much as I could do. And then most nights I would write after the kids went to bed for probably 2 to 4 hours, depending on circumstances. I tend to outline a fair bit, so I have a sense of which parts I need to fill. Now, I never write in a linear fashion, meaning that I have a sense of what I want to say, and granted that evolves, that will morph over time, but just because I've got chapter 1 through 10, it doesn't mean that I write them in order chapter 1 through 10. I think for the Geometry of Wealth, I changed the chapter structure over the course of the 1.5 to 2 years of intense writing, probably 4 or 5 times. Chapter titles changed probably 8 or 10 times.
And those fun quotes, when did you come up with that?
Yeah, there's quotes all over the place. I'm a sucker for quotes. People say really interesting things. So I've got Dr. Seuss and Dostoevsky and
Eric B. and Rakim. And
yeah, exactly. Don't sweat it, right? So those just kind of come along with the writing process. I'm thinking about something. I'll read a passage and there's a line that just becomes really meaningful to me. So, for example, the opening quote from Goethe that I read probably 3 to 4 years ago, and it might even have been like that deep inspiration for the entire venture in terms of the tone that I wanted to set. He had this line that said, this very quick line that said, "Do not hurry, do not rest." And like I read it and I paused, and I still sometimes read it and pause. I'm like, that really affects me. Okay, do not hurry. We don't want to blow through life. We want to enjoy it. But do not rest. Be motivated. Move forward. It's kind of the more versus enough tension that we talked about a little before, and I think keeping that quote in mind has been very helpful to me, not just as a writer, but as a father and as a husband, as a coworker. Yeah.
Awesome. I really do get it. So Adam asks, what do you do as a director of investment education?
Sure. So I work for Virtus Investment Partners. We are an asset management company, meaning that we create investment products that we sell to individuals and financial advisors and institutions like pension plans. And there are many asset management firms. Virtus is one. We have about $100 billion in assets. By contrast, Vanguard, the biggest of the big, has $5 trillion in assets. But people have heard of Vanguard and T. Rowe Price and Fidelity. So we're kind of in that world. We're a little bit smaller, more boutique-y. I was brought on board to help kind of shape thought leadership and content for the firm. So I spend a lot of time writing about behavioral finance, investment decision making, some of the things that we're talking about today, and then I deliver that either in white paper or in spoken form at conferences or seminars to the various clients of the firm. There's this chain of events that seems to have happened in our industry, at least in the finance industry, I should say, over the last few years, which is that content has become king. Now, I know content is everywhere. It's what you guys focus on, obviously. In the financial services, content has become really, really important. So there's this notion that I work on that we want to grab mind share before market share. I'm the guy at Virtus who is really thinking every day about mindshare. And it's cool because he basically puts me in the role as a teacher, as an educator. So I can write, tweet, blog, podcast, speak about all these things that I think are really important, not just to our clients per se, but the investment community more broadly.
So Virtus lets you be their voice? Like that's one of the things I was wondering about, because that's a big deal.
Well, they let me. It's not like I live in a distant distant country and I'm just sort of sending stuff over the transom. I'm working closely with the organization to think through what is it that our clients need.
Are you running stuff by them, or?
Oh yeah. Number one, I have a boss, right. And so yes, and other folks who are involved in the process. Also, from a financial services point of view, there were regulatory issues, so nothing goes out the door from a Virtus point of view that whether it be a speech that I've written or a white paper that I've written that our compliance officers and the federal government hasn't signed off on. So you just want to make sure that all your I's are dotted and T's are crossed. That said, I have a fair amount of latitude in terms of the types of things that I get to write about.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So, what are some of the books that helped you write your book, or like you looked at for inspiration?
That's a great question. So I'll mention I'll mention two quickly. One is what I'll call the Bible of behavioral finance, which is a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman and another gentleman named Amos Tversky, they literally invented this field of behavioral finance about 40 years ago. And they were psychologists. Tversky has passed, but they're psychologists who were looking at the economics literature on decision making, and as professional psychologists, they looked at the way economists were making assumptions about the way normal people make decisions, and they said, this is nuts. This doesn't make any sense. And so they introduced a psychological element to economic decision making. And so Thinking Fast and Slow is sort of it's just a really wonderful book. It's a little bit technical, but it's beautifully written. So I think it's pretty manageable to get through. If you really want to understand sort of investment decision making from a psychological point of view, that's wonderful. The second one I would recommend is called The Art of Choosing, which is a broader meditation on why choice is so important to us as human beings, written by a business school professor at Columbia. Her name is Sheena Iyengar. And what Professor Iyengar put together, I think, is just sort of a beautiful description, just not as to why we make the choices we do, but why choice is so important in our lives. It ends up that choice is a proxy for control in our lives, and when we have control, we feel great, and when we don't have control, we sort of know it in a second. We don't feel good. And she's a brilliant writer and storyteller, and The Art of Choosing probably impacted my professional writing trajectory more than any other book I've read.
Wow. So we have a few more questions here.
Great.
Let's see. What's one piece of advice that helped you in your career? Lana asks. You have to pick just one.
Just one. Yeah, I've been around for a while, and I've had a variety of different careers. I'll give one, and I hope it doesn't come across as generic, but I'll say be authentic. The times in my career when I've been least happy, least fulfilled, is when I've been living by other people's scripts. And you can't escape other people's scripts. Like, we all live in this big narrative structure, and people have expectations of you in terms of where you go to school, what you're going to study, the jobs that you're going to have, the family that you're going to build. I mean, there's conventional thinking about all of these things. And it's not that we want to be a maverick or a renegade every single day. That's tiresome and frankly a little bit annoying. That said, as you develop into whoever you want to be at this stage, because there's always going to be a next stage, I think it's important to be reflective about whether you're being true to your instincts, albeit being practical. I mean, part of the geometry of wealth, honestly, is that it's one thing to define your purpose, but it's another thing to have control over your money life so that you can underwrite that purposeful life. So, it's just not about kind of running off and becoming an artist who can't support him or herself. That sense of authenticity, I think, is as important as ever, because we are swimming in so much data, so much media, that you can sort of lose yourself and you can sort of implicitly mimic who you are based on other things you see. The advice I've gotten from various people at various times was, stressing that notion of authenticity.
Yeah, there's a lot of traps these days, right?
Tons of traps. There's so much behavior to model, and some of it's good and some of it's bad. And the game isn't deciding, okay, thumbs up, thumbs down, this is good or is bad. The game is this me? Is this who I really am? Because once you're sort of in your own head and you can focus on stillness and presence and enough, you know pretty quickly whether the person that you are at that moment is who you really want to be. And if you're not, it's a pretty crappy feeling, but it should also be kind of an awesome reminder that you have a choice to be somebody else.
So what's interesting, I'm going to go a little off script here, and I'll get back to people's questions, is that me listening to you, right? You in New York, you have the finance dudes,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
then you have the
Bros.
right, you have the bros, and then you have like the yoga people and like the like foo people.
Yep.
And somehow it seems like you've brought those two things together into, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you can be in that world and the other world. Were there certain resources that like really inspired you towards
Yeah.
the the self-fulfillment area of it, like the authenticity part, like
Yeah, so it's look, so it's interesting. You're like an anthropologist. You're seeing all these different groups around. When I write about, I think there's a chapter in the book called "What Matters" or "What Really Matters," and it walks through what I think are the four deep sources of contentment. And when I say what I think, I start with Aristotle and worked all the way through up to today and really looked at philosophy and religion and psychology and economics and neuroscience and sociology and so forth, and where are people over space and time really finding contentment. And real quick, there's four things. It's connection to others, because we're social animals. It's control over our lives. It's autonomy, but just not in the sense that, I want to walk across the street. It's also you have the control or the autonomy to tell your own story, which is really important, which happens up here and not physically. It's competence, being really good at something that's meaningful to you, so your vocation or a hobby. And then it's context. It's that sense that you're tied to something outside of yourself. If you read across all of those disciplines I mentioned, it does boil down to those four. And so whether it be the finance bros or what did you say, the foo-foo?
Yeah, whatever you want to call it, right?
Yeah,
the people call hippies or whatever, right?
Or yeah.
Do you think those people can't have wealth, don't have wealth, and they live a certain way, almost rejecting wealth?
The four things I just mentioned.
The extremism, yeah.
Yeah, the four things, I call them the four C's. So connection, control, context, and competence. That's the skeleton key. That unlocks any door. How you then choose to express that in your life and then in turn underwrite that through smart financial and money decisions, that's on you. I give a little bit of a playbook, but ultimately, there's a lot of things that happen in our day-to-day that you're responsible for. This is very much sort of a Stoic tale about money, kind of classic Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, and these guys talking about the fact that the only thing that you really have control over is you, and not what others do, but how you respond to them. So if you can take into account the four C's in terms of, okay, these are the deep sources of contentment or fulfillment, then you just got to run with it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. All right, so I'll just wrap it up here.
Okay.
Because someone was asking about your Twitter account.
Okay.
And usually we wrap up where people say, hey, follow me here.
Yeah,
all
yeah.
that. So why don't you tell a little bit about your Twitter account, your kind of what you're messaging out there, and then how people can find you and all that stuff.
So the best place is Twitter. So I'm at Brian Portnoy, just my full name. And I'm mostly focused on, I mentioned earlier this notion of FinTwit, financial Twitter. There's a relatively large community of people writing about investment decisions, about investor psychology, portfolios, budgeting, your personal balance sheet. It's cool because you can find these people and sort of build your own list. So actually, if you go to @Brian Portnoy and you look under my lists, I've got one that's called FinTwit, and I think that's the 20 or 25 people that I just sort of I'm engaging with every day. So go grab my list, and you'll be immediately up to speed on I think all of the top or nearly all of the top bloggers in that world. I don't do much on my LinkedIn page other than promote the book these days, but LinkedIn I find pretty useful just to reach out and meet people. So I would say Twitter is the way to connect with me, and love it if people reach out.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And it really sounds like you're giving it away.
Yeah.
And that's really, really great.
The amount of content that everybody from, whether you're a teenager or a retiree and everyone in between, the amount of content on being smart about your money broadly defined, I don't mean choosing the right mutual fund. I mean like big picture. the amount of free content that's out there, it's just a golden age. It's actually pretty cool that if you take a few steps to go find this stuff and read it and actually build a plan around it, it's right there for you. I think it's cool.
Awesome. All right, Brian Portnoy, Geometry of Wealth. Thank you so much for being with us.
This is awesome. This is fun.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.